Welcome to Leadership, Education, and Democracy, a program presented on behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, USA. Democracies today are facing a number of challenges globally. The 20th century saw some iconic leaders like Gandhi, Dr. King, Mandela. What set them apart? What is the role of education in leadership? What will tomorrow's leaders look like, and what kind of education will it take for them to be effective leaders? On this International Day of Democracy, we hope to shine some light on these questions. In 2008, His Highness the Aga Khan delivered the Peterson Lecture here in Atlanta, Georgia, at the annual meeting of the International Baccalaureate, where he said, and I quote, "Educating for leadership must imply something more than mere development of rote skills. Being proficient at rote skills is not the same thing as being educated. And training that develops skills, important as they may be, is a different thing from schooling in the art and science of thinking," unquote. He went on to say that in a world of rapid change, an agile and adaptable mind, a pragmatic and cooperative temperament, a strong ethical orientation, these are increasingly the keys to effective leadership. We are thrilled to engage in conversation with two accomplished experts. At this time, I'd like to welcome to you our moderator for today's program, an award-winning columnist for MSNBC and host of Valshi, Ali Valshi. Welcome, Ali. The Ismaili Council is grateful for your time today.
I'm grateful, Manoush, that you hosted this conversation, and frankly, it's an academic topic, but it's so remarkably relevant in today's world. So thank you for hosting it, and I'd like to introduce our remarkable guests to you today. I want to start with Professor Womack. Deanna Furry Womack is an associate professor of history of religions and interfaith studies at Emory University's Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, where she teaches on interfaith dialogue, Christian-Muslim relations, and American Islam. From 2015 to 2020, she directed the Leadership and Multi-Faith program, which was a joint endeavor between Candler and Georgia Tech's Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts. Professor Womack's historical research focuses on religious encounters in the Middle East and the United States, with particular attention to the gendered power dynamics in American Arab and Christian-Muslim relations. She's published and lectured widely on these subjects. She's the author of two books, Protestants, Gender, and the Arab Renaissance in Late Ottoman Syria, and Neighbors, Christians and Muslims Building Community, published in 2020. Her current book project examines the themes of gender and race in American Protestant discourses about Islam, and she's the recipient of a sabbatical grant for researchers from the Louisville Institute to support that research. Welcome, Professor Womack. Dr. Mohammed Khashoggi is a British-trained barrister with legal degrees and certifications from my alma mater, Queen's University in Canada, from the London University and Harvard Law School. He's also attended courses in Berlin, Brussels, The Hague Academy of Public International Law. He's an international specialist in cross-cultural mediation. He was elected to the steering committee of the World Mediation Forum. He's been a keynote speaker on conferences on mediation at the European Parliament and the French National Assembly. He's also addressed conferences as the keynote speaker in Buenos Aires, as Galway, Eindhoven, Vilnius, and Edmonton, Canada. He's an author of 4 books. He's a visiting lecturer in law. He's lectured at the London School of Economics, the School of Oriental and African Studies of London University, and the Institute of Ismaili Studies. For his lifetime work in mediation, he was awarded the prestigious Gandhi King Ikeda Peace Award, and he's a student of diasporic movements. He lived in Kenya during the momentous Winds of Change period. He studied in England, spent 30 years in France, working for the Aga Khan Secretariat and traveling through large parts of the developed world. He lives in the United Kingdom now. And he's very comfortable with this discussion. It's one that he's been having quite frequently. So thank you to both of you for being here. As I said, this is a momentous and important discussion. When we talk about Gandhi or King or Mandela, we talk about it usually in a historical context when there are awards or celebrations or anniversaries and things like that. That's not the case today. Today, we are looking at the movements that they were all part of, the ways in which they brought about change. And you both live in places or come from places where they were relevant. Dr. Khashoggi in South Africa and of Indian descent, Gandhi and Mandela are both very, very relevant to your work. And Professor Womack, not only is Martin Luther King's work relevant to what you do, but it's relevant to today. We're actually watching movements about democracy in the United States that entirely mirror what Martin Luther King was doing in the 60s in the United States. So let me start with you. Let's talk about the leadership styles of these people. We're talking about education. We're talking about leadership, how that plays into the moment that we are in the world, Professor.
Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here. So Gandhi, King, and Mandela were all charismatic leaders who were guided by their religious commitments and led by example. They named injustices of colonialism, of segregation, of discrimination in their own context. And they had the audacity to dream of a different world and to work to make those dreams a reality. They reached across lines of difference, of race and religion, and they inspired others to work alongside them for a new, just reality in India, in the United States, and in South Africa. And beyond those particular contexts, as we know, their work has also resonated with people around the globe who similarly long for justice. So one commonality that I mentioned that all three shared was their charismatic leadership. They spoke truth to power and they motivated their listeners to act. Now, of course, we could name other leaders in history who have used their charisma differently for personal gain and who motivated their followers through fear and lies and hatred and who've used their power to oppress. But Gandhi and King and Mandela are among those leaders who've used their great gifts for the good of others. They drew people together and they built movements to fight for justice and freedom. A second similarity in their leadership that I noted was their religious commitment and their openness to people of different faiths. So we also know that like personal charisma, religion can be and has been misused with devastating consequences. But King and Gandhi, especially as spiritual leaders, followed the moral teachings of their own faiths. And they sought to affirm the dignity of all humanity. And it was for that reason that even when facing physical brutality during marches and protests, they both embraced nonviolent resistance and love. And that included love of their oppressors. So as viewers may know, as a Christian pastor, Martin Luther King Jr.'s encounter with Gandhi's work shaped his understanding of Christian love and his own fight in the United States for justice. King considered Gandhi actually to be the first person to lift up the love ethic of Jesus Christ as a force for large-scale social change. And he found the transformative method that he had been seeking for years in Gandhi's teachings on nonviolence and on love. And faith was also important to Nelson Mandela, and the guidance of his own Christian tradition can be seen in his work for reconciliation after apartheid ended. And then the final point that I would make about the similarities in their leadership styles is that Mandela, King, and Gandhi all led by example. They devoted themselves to the struggle for freedom. They endured imprisonment, they risked their lives. Of course, Gandhi and King both died because of the causes that they were fighting for. So they were leaders who didn't lead from the sidelines. They didn't ask their colleagues and supporters to do anything that they weren't willing to do themselves. And for that reason, I would say that their legacies are shared with the many others who struggled alongside them and who continued their work after their deaths. And with that in mind, I think it would be important to mention those who worked alongside them. These iconic leaders and shared their legacies included their wives, Kasturba Gandhi, Coretta Scott King, Wendy Mandela, and Graça Machel. These women were activists and even icons in their own right. And I think we should also recognize their contributions to these legacies.
Yeah, that sort of work, imprisonment, and things that go on don't go on without your families being with you on this. I was so interested when you talked about charismatic leadership, and I thought, yeah, that's right. And then you mentioned that, by the way, the bad ones also have charismatic leadership. So that was an interesting point. I don't know how much love of other there is going on these days. So I think that's a remarkable point, that being informed by faith caused them all to have to do that, because I think today we are so polarized and that I don't know that we register all of that stuff. And the other point that you made that's relevant is even in similar movements today, even here in the United States, we are now seeing people prepared to put their bodies on the line. We are seeing, again, people prepared to be arrested in the cause what they believe. We are seeing nonviolent action come into vogue again in the way that it has not been since some of these movements. So thank you for that. Dr. Khashoggi, you spoke at Martin Luther King's, the 45th anniversary of his passing in Atlanta some years ago. And this is all very relevant to your thinking, including a book that you wrote on your family, our family's history. We're related. In South Africa, it has informed your life's work and your thinking. The influence of these leaders.
Yes, Ali. I mean, these, as Professor Womack said, these are moral icons, great giants. And to me, they're not only individuals of academic interest, but as you know, that having lived in South Africa, they've been very much part of my upbringing and growth. I think in the case of Gandhi, what I find fascinating about his leadership style is that Gandhi lived by the very principles that are attributed in sayings to him. He may not have said what people said he said, but obviously whatever is attributed to him sticks because he lived his life that way. And the two that stick into my mind is be the change you wish to see done in the world. Gandhi actually lived the principles he wanted to see take place. The second point in his life and leadership style that appeals so much to me is the aphorism that there is enough in the world for our need, but not enough for our greed. And I think that as early as the first decade of the 20th century, Gandhi actually lived these principles in life. When he gave up his three-piece suit, having been a barrister from the British Inns of Court in as early as 1906, he was explaining to his wife Kasturba why they did not need all this money. And he gave all this up. All the gifts that were given to him, he gave up at that time for the greater cause. So I think that these were principles of Gandhi's life that were very real and lived at the time. I was reading an article today about cosmopolitan ethics. The Aga Khan mentions them, Joe Kwame, Anthony Appiah speaks about it as well. But the school to which your grandfather went in 1912, the Tolstoy Farm School, was a school that Gandhi ran with a Jewish architect, teaching children from Christian, Parsi, Hindu, Muslim, Shia, Sunni backgrounds. And here was a Hindu lawyer teaching moral principles to students from different communities in 1910. I mean, that's quite earlier on in the game. As for Mandela, the two most abiding leadership qualities that just are so palpable, one is the notion of forgiveness and compassion. Mandela didn't use it as a medal; he lived it. And the second one is inclusivity. I mean, if you look in South Africa today, though South Africa has difficulties, some very severe difficulties, but if you look at anybody singing the national anthem, Mandela has made the flag, the anthem, and sports part of the fabric of the country, where people feel that the colors on the flag represents their past histories. They don't represent a rejection of the past. And here I can think of a fascinating example that was told personally to me by one of Nelson Mandela's closest friends, Ahmed Kathrada. When Mandela was the president, there was a 10-year-old child, 10 or 11-year-old girl called Michelle Brits, who was dying of leukemia. And her family wanted to make sure that before she died, her dreams were materialized. There was a group called Dreams in South Africa that wanted to give her everything she wanted. And she wanted just two things. She wanted to go to Robben Island, which they took her to. And the second wish before she died is she said, I want to shake hands with Mr. Mandela. At that time, Mr. Mandela was the busiest president in the world, perhaps. And Mr. Kathrada tells me that he phoned up Mr. Mandela and he said, Mr. Mandela, there's this little girl who's dying. She just wants to hold your hand. Can she meet you? And Mr. Mandela said, where is she? And he said, she's in Pretoria. And he said, wow, that's 1,000 miles away. What do we do? So Kathrada said, she will fly anytime you need her. We will bring her here. And you know what Nelson Mandela says? She can't come here. She's not well. He said, tell the family on one evening, I will come to her bedside. And he went and he bought a whole lot of toys and went with military helicopter, went to Michelle's bedside, and there's a photo of him hugging this girl, and there are tears down both their eyes. Now, this is a man who was not allowed to go to the funeral of his son by the people of Michelle Britz's community, the Afrikaners. Mandela did not allow vindictiveness to come into his human consideration of giving this child happiness. Then we go to Martin Luther King, and I think only two things there which touch me, and both are from his writings, which are absolutely fascinating. The first is the notion of justice, where Martin Luther King says, injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a simple garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Ironically, it took a pathogen to remind us of the reality of what Martin Luther King was trying to tell us 60 years ago. And yet, I don't think the reality is dawned on humanity at this moment. And the last point I'd like to make in this particular discourse is his whole question of speaking truth to power. Martin Luther King says, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And I think, Ali, as a journalist who talks truth to power, I don't think anybody can deny that you were right in the middle of those the turbulence in Minnesota. I think these were people who can speak to the time at present. These are issues right at our doorstep. These are not historical issues. These are real issues.
You're absolutely right about that. These are not historical issues. I didn't expect to, by the way, be part of this whole issue in the last year in the United States. It was a peaceful march that I was reporting on in Minneapolis over a year and a half ago, and I suddenly got hit by a police rubber bullet, and all of a sudden you realize what people who deliberately put themselves in the line of these things face. Which brings me to my next question. I think you both made the point. This is not just historical. We are living in what is a remarkably fragmented world, surprising, given everything we went through in the 20th century, given the First World War, given the Second World War, given the Civil Rights Movement, given the independence movements around the world, from India through to Africa. Given all of that, I am surprised that we are where we are. I am surprised that here in the United States, where I live, and in parts of Europe, and certainly in parts of Eastern Europe, we are still discussing, we are debating, we are fighting about actual democracy. So when we talk about these three giants of history who definitely left their mark on the 20th century, and who are, I think, in heaven, we're probably hoping to rest a little bit, they're not looking down and saying, well, what did you guys do? How did you mess this up? We had this all going in the right direction. So what would they say, in your opinion? We'll start with you, Professor Womack. What would these leaders advise today's leaders, today's warriors of social justice about their fight?
That's really a great question. It's too bad that they're not here to guide us, but they've left us with so many writings and speeches and the guidance that I think we could take seriously. But the first thing that comes to mind is that Gandhi, King, and Mandela would encourage us to keep hope alive. I think that's something that they had to do day after day. And with the hindsight to reflect back on national and global history, since their own time as leaders, I think they could also assure us that positive change has happened. And that's important because we're starting to feel disillusioned as we see the same sorts of problems arising again, or perhaps they never stop. So I think that they would affirm then that our ongoing work for civil and human rights will bear fruit in time. But secondly, with that in mind, I think they would recognize with us the difficulties that we're facing, whether it's police brutality against Black and brown bodies in the United States, or the disparity in access to COVID-19 vaccinations around the world right now. I think that these leaders would guide us in light of these persistent challenges to learn patience and to wait and hope and not give up. And of course, like they did, that doesn't mean waiting around passively for change to happen, but acting with the knowledge that change often happens a lot more slowly than we would like it to. So I think about Nelson Mandela in prison for 27 years. He certainly waited in hope. And then the third thing that I would note is there's a lesson I think here to be learned from the three of them about interfaith relationship building. And of course, this is my area of teaching and study. But each one of these leaders was rooted in his own faith and open to working alongside people of other faiths. So when fighting against white and European cultural supremacy, they turned to the moral teachings of their faith, but they didn't respond with assertions of religious superiority, as many around them were. Instead, they found ways to join together to address human needs that cut across religious differences. So for one example, you could look at the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, where Martin Luther King Jr. walked alongside the Jewish theologian, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And King called Heschel a great prophet and saw him as an ally with whom he shared a commitment to liberation. And then in the US today, because of global migration and because of a commitment to liberty and welcome to immigrants and refugees that at least we've had intermittently, we are living in a more deeply multi-faith society than we ever have before. So here in the US and in many other parts of the world, I would say because of the increasing diversity and global migration, that we face the possibility of either religious hostility or interfaith friendship. And I do think that we could use a reminder from leaders who have gone before us that we can collaborate interreligiously for the common good while still holding true to the teachings of our own traditions.
Yeah, and sorry, but didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, and I think maybe this should have been the first one. I'll note a challenge that was already a concern for Dr. King and Gandhi in the mid-20th century, and one that Nelson Mandela actively addressed before his death in 2013. And that challenge is environmental destruction and global climate change. We're hearing the reports from the UN today about this, and they're saying that we have a red light. It's a red light warning for all of humanity. But I believe that if these three leaders could guide us today, they would definitively tell us that caring for the earth is a matter of justice and human dignity. And although this is a concern for every being on earth, the effects of climate change disproportionately devastate those communities that are most marginalized and those whose resources have been exploited. So this includes ethnic and religious minorities, women and children, formerly colonized nations. I'm certain that these three leaders would urge us to strive for climate justice as a way to continue their own legacies.
I think you're right, because they were all involved in social justice issues that were contemporary to their time. And when you look at all of them, in fact, it's lost on some people that the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, it was an economic justice rally that he was there for. He was there to support striking sanitation workers. Mahatma Gandhi was always talking about fairness and wages. Much of Nelson Mandela's work was rooted in and with labor union leaders, and the reason it was relevant was these workers wanted better rights. Today, the Reverend Dr. William Barber in the United States, the head of the Poor People's Campaign, gets arrested largely on a weekly basis now in the United States. But in his campaign for voting rights and human rights and civil rights is economic rights and an increase in minimum wage. So these social justice movements are broader than simply give us rights or give us voting rights. Dr. Khashoggi, what do you think they would tell us today?
Thank you, Dr. Womack, for such a good background on which I can sort of segue. First of all, I think all these three men were prisoners of their time in a funny way. They could only do what they did at the time they did what they did because they had to overcome a certain hump. Gandhi had to get control of India's independence from the British government at the time. It was a gargantuan task. 450 million people got their independence through mobilization, non-violent mobilization, though we had violent consequences of partition, but Gandhi didn't stand for that. I mean, Gandhi's life was non-violent. In the case of Mandela, if you read the last chapter of his beautiful No Walk to Freedom, isn't it?
Long Walk to Freedom, yeah.
Long Walk to Freedom. I think the last chapter of his book is one that is so worthy of reading, not once, but a number of times, if one sees the present insurrection in South Africa. Mandela recognized that as you come to the top of a hill, you're going to see another hill and a third hill. And he spoke about what does it mean to be free. He said, we are now free to start working for freedom. So I think that was a stark realization that his struggle for economic justice had just begun. And the same with Martin Luther King. I mean, what he stood for, he was a man who understood the problems of the oppressed. He did not speak about Black people as the only oppressed people, but saw the Black problem, the problem of racism, it was a symptom of a larger economic pathogen where exploitation, otherization, demonization was part of the process. And I would argue is still part of the process. But I think that all three men saw that their life was rather circumscribed by the immediate need of fighting for visible injustice before one could go into the deeper structural injustices that one had to address. I think two things that may come up if these guys had to wake up in wherever they are, hopefully in heaven. First of all, they say, why are you using our name to perpetrate abuses? Because there is now a distortion of a Gandhian principle, of a Mandelian principle, of a Kingian principle for people who are politically motivated to fight just for the opposite principle. Yes. And I think that we need to be very conscious about the instrumentalization of what I would call pious commitments of people before in the name of present-day political gains. And I think that these 2-3 people can speak to us with a very, very strong voice, as Dr. Womack said, in the field of environmental degradation, in the field of social justice, in the eradication of poverty, in the rights of children, in the very critical issues of the rights of women, gender justice, not only the rights of women, but gender justice in the larger context of how can we decide whose faith is correct, whose sexuality is correct, whose ethics are correct. I think it's a sense of utter hubris and immodesty for human beings to sit in judgment of another human being and to otherize and demonize them without going into the deeper understanding of the human predicament. And I think these moral giants can speak to us from the grave. They do not need to come out and tell us what to do. We need to go and consult them and say, look, this is what you stood for. This is what we think brought us where we are. Are we still going on the right path? I think that's where I would mention their work.
Well, both of you have done a great deal of work in making what they do relevant to today. One of the things in the United States, there are arguments about whether this is the most perfect democracy in the world or this is so brutally flawed. And I think when you think about the founding fathers' terminology about making a more perfect union, it's like Mandela. We are free to seek freedom. We are not a perfect union. We haven't figured this out. We may not figure this out, but we should always strive to be making it a better union. Dr. Womack, you have spent a significant amount of time studying and writing on Muslim-Christian relations in the United States and abroad. You've authored a number of articles on the lives of Christians under Muslim rule, as well as you just mentioned in your last answer, interfaith and interreligious matters. I'm going to ask you again, because everything that the two of you are talking about and have written about over the years is weirdly relevant today. So how do you connect the studying you've done on interfaith work to where we are today?
Thank you. I love the statement, being free to seek freedom. So to connect these questions about democracy to my work, I'd say in a democracy, all citizens can freely participate in social activities, political processes, and that, of course, includes people of different faiths. But I'd say also for a democratic system to truly work, we need something more than simply equal rights enshrined by law. So that's the beginning. You have the democracy, you have the freedom. Now you have to get to work. And that work is to begin developing respect and appreciation of religious and cultural and other differences at the local level. And Dr. Khashoggi earlier mentioned a variety of identities that are oppressed and marginalized. And so it's the appreciation and the respect and the engagement with people who are different. Now, in my own research on Christian-Muslim relations, it's focused on Ottoman Syria, which is present-day Syria and Lebanon. And I found that local Christians and Muslims there lived alongside one another in the same community as colleagues and as equals under Ottoman Islamic rule in the Middle East, even as the imperial government itself in the 19th century was oscillating back and forth between authoritarianism and constitutional monarchy. So you don't have to have a perfectly free political system for this kind of personal on-the-ground relationship building to happen. Now, in the United States, where we have set ourselves up as an exemplary democracy, I've also found that our history has involved a perpetual struggle to ensure voting and other rights, that these aren't exclusively given to people of a particular gender or skin color or religion. So in the US today, I see that cooperation and understanding between Americans of multiple religious traditions will be necessary to strengthen and ensure our democracy. And some of the recent discussion about democracy and the threat of autocracy relates to US foreign policy, and it pits us against China and Russia, or perhaps against a theocracy like Iran. But for the US internally, the challenge has always been to ensure that the principles of democracy are upheld, so everyone has a voice and everyone can prosper. And I'm from the state of Georgia, so we know that recent laws here and in other states have made it more difficult for everyone to vote. And these, I think, are a demonstration of partisan power on the way to gaining more partisan power, and the sort of actions that threaten democracy. The fact, so from an interfaith perspective, the fact that Christian nationalist groups support voter suppression is a particular concern for the interfaith movement in the US. And I would also say to many Christians, for that matter, who don't follow that kind of skewed ideology. Because Christian nationalist ideology threatens the freedom of religion. That's been the cornerstone of American democracy. These groups want an American autocracy, perhaps, or they hope for a theocracy that informs their own ideology. And we know, because of history, that whenever power remains in the hands of a few, that power comes at the expense of almost everyone else. So I think it's beyond interfaith relations. That's a piece of it. But it is really something that on every level we need to be concerned about.
Thank you for that. It is remarkably relevant. Dr. Khashoggi, this is a remarkable speech. In 2004, at the Leadership and Diversity Conference, His Highness the Aga Khan said, and I'm quoting, "The existence of political parties and elections do not alone produce stable governments or competent leadership." He went on to state, three concepts seem to be essential in creating, stabilizing, and strengthening democracy around the world. These concepts are meritocracy, pluralism, and civil society. That speech could have been made last week. It's remarkable because we are finding in places, like I said, here in the United States and other very well-established democracies, that the things we thought that guarantee stability are not the things that guarantee stability. So what are your perspectives on these concepts of meritocracy, pluralism, and civil society as they apply today?
Ali, I think that speech was in the context where the Aga Khan was speaking about Canada's contribution to a coherent and dynamic moral vision, which is inclusive, which it's a balanced ecosystem based on recognizing difference, creating a consensus through compromise, and allowing space for a vibrant civil society. You know, when I read that speech earlier, Ali, I was thinking of these three themes or the three drivers that the Aga Khan mentioned. And interestingly enough, just a few days ago, somebody sent me an article written by a chap called John Deans, I think, or somebody from the University of, John Keane, Keane, from the University of Sydney, who speaks about the slow death of democracy. Globally, democracy is going through a slow death. He calls it democide. And I think if we really try to see what are the causes of failed democracies, I think the notion of governance lies at the heart of the big problem. You know, governance, how can you ensure governance with sustainable growth, where people find that they have a stake in what is happening? And sadly, we are beginning to see a tremendous attrition in the credibility of democracy. I mean, India at one time was hailed as a major global democracy. I remember many years ago, Ali, you may have been very young at that time, but when I qualified as a lawyer in Canada, I came to Toronto and heard a lecture by a brilliant constitutional lawyer called Nani Palkhiwala, a brilliant man from India. And I remember Mr. Palkhiwala said, India's democracy showed to Mrs. Gandhi that those people who were selling their little cigarettes in the street, the pan and the biriwalas, they call them the biriwalas, they were able to tell Mrs. Gandhi that you may come from a very exalted family, but eventually you can't buy our dignity. We have the right. We can vote. and we will vote you out. That, sadly, that nature of democracy globally is beginning to wither. And even India as a democracy today in the Democracy Index of 2020, according to King, ranks lower than Hungary, Guatemala, and Sierra Leone. I mean, what does that tell us? What does it tell us that global, demographically powerful democracies, I mean, India is not a small country. We're talking about over 1 billion people. When you see democracy withering in situations like that, one needs to think back that what are the indices that make a democracy work. For the Aga Khan, he sees in his speech, he mentions 3 principles that he saw from his own experiences, where he talks of civil society, pluralism, and meritocracy. And I was trying to reflect on all 3 of those because as a lawyer, I'm always very conscious to know how do they work. I think in the case of civil society, a vibrant civil society can assure people, particularly in rural areas, of a reasonable prospect of humane treatment, access to opportunities, security, personal security, absence of discrimination, equity. Civil society alone cannot do it, but they do fight for those type of principles. Secondly, the notion of pluralism. The whole idea that today we're looking at countries in the world which are suffering from unfinished issues of decolonization. So we have tribes, we have ethnicities, we have religious groups, we have social groups, we have economic groups. And when they are able to rally around a common purpose, when different ethnicities, different groups, different people are able to rally around a certain purpose that is valuable, you find that that pluralistic approach, backed by a vibrant civil society, produces a great antidote to any democratic problems that the nation state alone cannot handle. And I think meritocracy is a very important factor because in that type of a situation, meritocracy is important, but meritocracy, as the Aga Khan himself emphasized, only takes place when equal opportunity is guaranteed to people. It's the equity for further development. Right. You can't tell somebody be meritocratic if they have not got the opportunity to participate in this process. So the notion of meritocracy, pluralism, and civil society working in tandem, to me, gives you the domino effect. If they work together, there's synergy. And if one of them begins to break down, you could have difficulty. My perspectives on each of these drivers is that they are interconnected and they are non-severable. You can't say, well, we'll destroy civil society, but we'll have pluralism. Or we'll destroy pluralism, but we'll give meritocracy. I don't think they can work independently. They have to work mutually, and they reinforce each other. And I think as a great, great antidote to the death of democracy, these are the concepts that we can reinforce through practical ways of empowering people on the ground to become democratically literate and democratically engaged in the process of their own betterment and their own safety and their own well-being, so that they can become an extra prop to the whole nation system of upholding certain values.
Thank you for that. Relevant in a lot of areas today where we've seen those nation states collapse, or we've seen meritocracies exist where there isn't pluralism or equality. You can't, meritocracy in an aristocracy doesn't work because it's not really a meritocracy. It's not all fair. Dr. Womack, in your very important book, Neighbors, Christians and Muslims Building Community, you stress the need for deeper dialogue between faith communities. You cite in the book a deeper need for faith leaders to understand pluralism, because we live in these increasingly multi-faith societies. His Highness the Aga Khan, in that same 2004 speech to which I referred, raised the question, quote, what can be done to preempt the risk that the rejection of pluralism will become the spark that sets human conflict aflame? He's further stressed the enormous importance of competence and advancement by merit. This is interesting because the concept of the rejection of pluralism setting human conflict aflame seems to be a danger through which we are living right now. And I will say, most of what I do journalistically is political. I'm a business and economics and politics journalist, but I have faith leaders on a lot for this very discussion, because people who are committed to their faiths believe that what we are witnessing out in the world, in America and in many parts of the world, these anti-pluralistic tendencies are completely counter to their faith learnings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the rejection of pluralism was a risk in 2004, just as it is today. And we continue to see anytime that human conflicts arise, it's because people prevent diversity of participation in civil society and government. And so we know that the practice of exclusion is not just happening, in the 21st century. I'm also a historian, so I write on interreligious encounters in history. We see it all throughout human history. But as you pointed out, people of faith are concerned, and they feel that these sorts of actions are against the teachings of their own traditions. And so I think one hopeful note is that the practice of welcoming the stranger and embracing learning and learning from difference is ancient as well. And the scriptures of many religious traditions will teach us this. So I wrote my book on Christian-Muslim dialogue in the United States with religious leaders in mind, because I believe that it is incredibly important for them to understand that this pluralism is a reality within which we live. And that by recognizing and affirming this reality and working within this reality, we have a much greater opportunity to learn and to deepen our own understanding of people of multiple faiths, and to practice being a good neighbor, which is a calling for people of faith. And so I'd say this includes recognizing competence and merit of those that we meet, as His Highness recommended in the speech, rather than judging based on how alike or how different others are from us. And beyond those personal relationships, as you and Dr. Khashoggi said, meritocracy and equal opportunity is needed at every level of society. But in the work that I do, I'm trying to help people to start that on the ground level with their neighbors, and there's a need for that at the national level too. So I do find reasons for optimism and hope, even though I see these disheartening divisions. In the first place, I'm optimistic because we have to have hope, right? We want to survive. We want to live out our callings to be good neighbors, and so we have to have hope. But the second reason is, at least where interfaith dialogue and understanding are concerned, in the United States, interfaith movements have become much more widespread in the past couple decades or so. And I should note, for anyone who's unfamiliar, that these movements aren't trying to change our religious commitments, but to help people of different religious traditions or of no religious affiliation to understand each other and to find ways of living together as friends and neighbors and allies.
They're fundamentally pluralistic. Nobody's changing their belief system.
Right, absolutely. And so we're seeing this, at the nationwide level. Locally, we're seeing it in Christian seminaries like my own at Emory, where we're not just teaching about world religions, we're teaching about interfaith dialogue. Also at undergraduate institutions, with the support of Ibu Patel and Interfaith Youth Corps, we're seeing more and more interfaith studies programs. So I do think that young people today have a new opportunity that many of us didn't have, to learn and to get the kind of practical training that has been missing to become interreligiously aware global citizens. And I see this in my own students, that they're ready to go out and they're ready to change the world. And that does give me hope.
Well, I'm glad, because as students of history, you both find hope. I'm a journalist and I live in the now, and it's a little harder for me right now. So I'm heartened by the fact that you both see hope. Look, globalization could suggest that new forms of democratic citizenship and politics are emerging, but it does seem, certainly here in the United States, that parts of our educational system, our public educational system, remains resistant to global perspectives in the curriculum, and they result in high school graduates in the United States. And I just don't know enough about other countries to know whether this is universal, but certainly high school graduates in the United States who may not be able to fully understand or explain the complexities of global issues and the impact of them on our world. I want to play a clip from a speech that His Highness delivered in Atlanta in 2008 at the annual meeting of the International Baccalaureate. Let's listen.
In the years ahead, should we not expect a student at an IB school in Atlanta to know as much about Jomo Kenyatta or Muhammad Ali Jinnah as a student in Mombasa or Lahore knows about Atlanta's great son, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.? Should a Bangladeshi IB student reading the poems of Tagore at the Aga Khan Academy in Dhaka, not also encounter the works of other Nobel laureates in literature, such as the Turkish novelist Orhan Pamuk, or America's William Faulkner, or Toni Morrison? Should the study of medieval architecture not include both the Chartres Cathedral in France and the Mosque of Djenné in Mali? And shouldn't IB science students not learn about Ibn al-Haytham, the Muslim scholar who developed modern optics, as well as his predecessors Euclid and Ptolemy, whose ideas he challenged? As we work together to bridge the gulf between East and West, between North and South, between developed and developing economies, between urban and rural settings, we will be redefining what it means to be well educated.
So, Dr. Khashabji, I want to start with you. You are obviously, I've known you my entire life, and you are definitely someone who has experienced a global education and global perspectives. I've lost count. I think you've lived in 4 or 5 countries, but you've always respected that. You've always thought that's the way people should learn. We are grabbing on in the Western world to nativism and populism and you know, these movements that don't make you want to learn about other people, and they're taking hold in public policy. How do we counter that?
You know, Ali, you're hitting on a point which is very interesting, and I think it was prognosticated years ago. Was it, who wrote The Global Paradox? Was it Naismith? The American book, The Global Paradox.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the things we saw happening, that as the world would move towards greater globalization, we would see people moving into a greater degree of nativization. And there would be a conflict between globalism and a tribal way of looking at things. The two, I think, are a process that go hand in hand. I think there is a great need to redefine the educational philosophy today. The late Ken Robinson of Britain used to always say this, that our educational system today is geared to a second world construct, second wave construct. It was basically a conveyor belt system that was produced for an industrial society. Our educational system is not geared for meeting the needs of an information society. So from a functional point of view, what Robinson used to say is that the school destroys the creativity of a child. There have been researches that a kid becomes, with all this problem about, attention deficit syndrome and all that problem, is all a function of the educational system not being able to contain the creativity of the children. So it's no wonder that some of the great innovators of our time were really high school dropouts. So fundamentally, something is wrong at one level of the educational system globally. And we're all following the same educational system in one way or another. But at a deeper level, I ask myself, how far does the educational system prepare us for the greater challenges that we have to face in life? You know, life is not a linear trajectory. Life is filled with all sorts of complexities. I often ask myself that in my own life, it's at this age that I've come to realize that in some of the things I studied, and I'm a lawyer, I did a master's, I did a doctorate in conflict, I ask myself, should I have not known earlier in my life subjects such as philosophy, at least some smattering, anthropology, some idea, literary criticism? And I tell you why I say those 3 things. Philosophy teaches you to ask the right questions in life, the big questions in life. Anthropology teaches you how people make meaning. Literary criticism teaches us how to understand texts, to go beyond rote learning. Now, where do we source this new idea of a global education? And what should a global education encompass with all the challenges that we are seeing today? We are already seeing great challenges with people being able to send their children to school to start off with. if we now had to, and this is not only in the third world, we are beginning now to see these challenges, which as a child I normally thought you associate with Nairobi or Bombay or Durban or Dar es Salaam or Sierra Leone or Jordan. These are the issues that are facing millions of kids in the Western world today. Is our education fit for purpose? Are we financing education to allow people to play a major role in society? Is our education going to even be valid with 47% of our jobs being taken over by artificial intelligence? These are all global issues. And in this globalization process, the Aga Khan has a vision. And I mean, I was a product of the school he created 70 years ago, 80 years ago in Nairobi, 60 years ago. I think the Aga Khan says, how do you square global education with respecting your own particularity? So his philosophy is that don't give up who you are. Who you are is important, but what you have become as a function of this global difference makes you responsible for something beyond yourself. But you don't have to give yourself up in order to embrace something bigger than yourself. Sadly, today, people are not in a position to be able to square their global identity with their particular identity.
This is an interesting point.
It's a critical point. So you'll either have populism that will find scapegoats. I'm an Afrikaner, I should get into a lager. All the non-whites are our enemies. I mean, I'm just caricaturing. The attitude of getting into your lager and closing yourself off from all over the world and saying, my lager is my universe and I will live in it. It's impractical. At a global level, the fear is of homogenization. Because if you find that every country in the world, if you come out and the first thing you see is a McDonald's, then people are going to say, am I in Karachi? Am I in Syria? Am I in Jordan? Am I in Kabul? Or am I in London? So how do you balance out people's fears of their culture being totally submerged with their ability to embrace a larger world where somebody who's 10,000 miles away is as much as your neighbor as the person next door?
The issue here, Professor Womack, is that, again, I'm using my example here in the United States. There are a lot of people who are not aiming to solve this problem. In fact, it's the opposite. We are not looking for heterogeneity. We are looking for homogeneity. We are not understanding that being a global citizen doesn't have to work against your who you are culturally or where you're from or your local history. We have a very deliberate push in America away from that. In fact, as you know, the current struggle we've got is not even about not learning global stuff. It's not learning some of our own critical history in the United States. And then we have the social media, which is again removing the ability to critically think about issues. So disinformation and misinformation spreads more quickly, underpinning these ideas of homogeneity and polarization.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, especially about learning our own critical history, because if we revisited history, we would understand, that this nation itself is a nation mainly of migrants, refugees, and their descendants, as well as Native Americans. And it's not a push for Native American culture, right? It's a push for white Western European culture. I think that it's important to name that. But in my experience, I believe fully that a global orientation to education would be beneficial to students in the United States at all grade levels because of this, because we don't live in a bubble. This is, what we've been talking about today, that Americans are tied to people around the globe, always have been. And as Dr. Khashoggi said earlier, this pandemic, if nothing else, has proven that our lives are connected to billions of people that we've never met. With that said, I do believe that we have several different public school systems in the United States, and some of the public school curricula and programs have changed over the past decade or so since the speech. We have made progress. I've lived in places where Spanish is taught to kindergartners, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. And now living in Atlanta, it's a very ethnically and internationally diverse place. And so, it depends on where you live. International baccalaureate programs and high schools and middle schools have increased. So I think that we can see some progress while also recognizing that many American students do graduate without understanding the globalized world and their place in it. And I also think because religion is part of this globalized world, that efforts to promote awareness of diversity of religions here and around the world would also be very beneficial, especially in an educational context where the student body or wider community is relatively homogenous. And I think also, in addition to this, communities need to place higher value on courses in the humanities and extracurricular activities that would broaden students' worldviews, like Model UN, for example. That would encourage more students to take advantage of the opportunities that already exist. So I have seen many of our public schools do have courses like world history, world literature, language classes, art history. These sorts of classes, of course, new curricula could be added, but I don't think that American students are taking advantage of the opportunities that they do have, whether it's in courses or in extracurricular activities, to gain that global perspective. And I think it's partly a result of our wider culture. For example, because of our reliance on English, American students are so far behind in learning second languages. That would be a great benefit to them, in terms of their economic viability in this country, beyond just being able to engage with more sensitivity with people around the globe, and also with fellow Americans of different cultural and religious backgrounds. So I do think that this, although I teach at the secondary level, and I hope that in our private schools like Emory, I think we are doing a great job making up for the lack in global education in high schools. But I think that there's certainly more resources that could be given.
But there are people who would listen to this conversation and tell us that this is wrong, that what we are trying to do is subvert culture. I know that they'll say it in the United States. I imagine this is all over the world. There are lots of places where they'll say, you're trying to subvert our culture by imposing global education, which sounds the same as globalism, which is the root of so many populist movements, right? So much of what we are seeing in populism today is a push against globalism.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ali, I may also add one thing to what Dr. Womack said, that this is not only an American insular approach, it also has its counterpart in many other countries. I mean, there were certain countries where they said, you don't need to learn English, teach children in the vernacular. That is, again, economic, educational nationalism was also a problem in many countries. And I think there is a recognition today globally that an educated person is a person who's globally educated. So you do not look at Westernization and modernization as something to abjure any more than looking at tribal and cultural and indigenous cultures as something old-fashioned. I think there has to be a pluralistic respect for diversity and an engagement in learning another language, in learning another culture, in learning another instrument. I mean, today the whole notion of learning an instrument in which only Eastern music can be played is a remarkable approach to cultural understanding. What Ravi Shankar did with Jampaya Rampal or Yehudi Menuhin. I mean, the sitar and the sarod and the santur being played with a different instrument which is Western. To me, that is sound education because it gives rise to new creative energy in cultural dynamics. And I think that's what we need to now capture with the younger generation that is coming up.
I have so much more to discuss with you, but we are running short of time. This should be an 8 or 9 hour conversation with the two of you. Thank you for the remarkable work that you've both done, the commitment you've made to studying these things, the idea that you have brought history into such a contemporary context for us. We appreciate your time. Dr. Mohammad Khashoggi and Professor Deanna Furey-Womack, what a great conversation this is, and may we continue to work toward a better democracy globally.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Charlie.